Good evening. I'm Gracelyn Guyol, and welcome to Restoring Health Holistically. My guest today is Tara Cook-Littman. She is a graduate of the Cardozo School of Law, and she worked as a prosecuting attorney in New York City before coming to Connecticut and being a leader in opposing genetically modified organisms that are called commonly GMOs. She is the mother of three, and Tara is concerned about consumers' rights to know what's in our foods, since it is the foundation of health. She has traveled throughout Connecticut creating awareness of GMO health risks and building a grassroots support for foods containing GMOs to require labeling, giving consumers a choice about knowing what they are eating. Her skillful use of a large social media network she developed brought such a deluge of emails and phone calls to Connecticut Governor Daniel Malloy and House Speaker Brendan Sharkey that a GMO labeling bill passed in 2013, the first year it was proposed, which is an almost unheard of feat. Since then, Tara has focused on winning passage of similar legislation in other states through the Citizens for GMO labeling. Let's start with the basics, Tara. Welcome. It's great to see you again.
Thank you for having me.
Would you please briefly explain to viewers how GMOs are different from hybridized plants? Because many of my friends really don't understand that there's a big difference.
Sure. So it's really interesting you start with that question because the opposition continues to tell us GMOs have been happening for thousands of years with no problems, and it's just not true. The GMOs that we want labeled have actually been on the market since 1996. So we're not talking about crossbreeding or hybridization that could happen in nature and do happen in nature. That's the biggest difference. Mm-hmm. The genetically engineered crops that we're talking about could never happen naturally. It takes place in a facility, a science lab, with a gene gun where they take the DNA from one species and insert it into the genes of a completely other species. These are totally transgenic. So that's where you're possibly taking the genes from a bacteria or a virus, which is what they're doing, and putting it into the DNA of our food, the vegetables that we eat.
Well, when I was working in the wine industry, they were just beginning to do some of that in the wine industry, and they were actually putting genes from like shrimp or something into grapes to try and beef up their ability to withstand some sort of attack or to make them have different flavors. I mean, this was very early on. Sure. This was 30 years ago. And I was appalled when I heard about genetically modified organisms in our food chain. And that's not been recently, but it was quite a while ago. But I thought, well, what if they take something like shellfish, which many people are so allergic to, and take a gene for some reason unknown of shellfish and insert it in a grain, and people would have an allergic reaction and they would have no idea what was causing it. Right. So it's like, and they don't know how, when you crossbreed what they've modified, how that's going to turn out. It's like opening Pandora's box.
It is.
Which you can't close.
No, once it's out in nature, you can't recall it. It's there.
It's not like GM. You can't recall something that makes a mistake.
And we've seen that happen where they've done field trials of some genetically engineered wheat, and they're still finding traces of that genetically engineered wheat out in Oregon. And that's a real issue because it was never approved. It's not supposed to be on the market, but it's still out there. So that is a real problem.
Okay, so what we have is something that's a frankenfood.
Well, yes, that's definitely a term that some people use, and it's something that, again, like I said, cannot be created naturally.
Okay. And so I'll let you explain why people might want to avoid GMOs.
There are many reasons that people want to avoid GMOs, and that's why we want labeling, because in the end, it really shouldn't matter. Your reasons for avoiding GMOs might actually be completely different from my reasons. But I'll start with potential health risks to human beings. So there has never been a long-term feeding study done by our government in the United States to verify the safety of GMOs. Right now what's happened is the burden to prove that GMOs are dangerous has been flipped onto consumers like myself, rather than the burden being on the industry trying to sell GMOs and our federal government to prove that they're safe.
And the industry that profits mightily
Correct.
from these original things.
Yes, it's $1 billion industry for them. So we actually call this tobacco science because the studies that are being done are short-term studies conducted by the very industry profiting from the sale of GMOs, which is just like what was going on with tobacco. We were listening to tobacco companies tell us that smoking was perfectly fine for our health. Right now, we're expected to believe companies like Monsanto and Dow and Syngenta, who are profiting billions of dollars off the sale of GMOs, and they're telling us they're completely safe, and our government is just accepting that as true and moving on, not conducting their own safety testing. So health risks are one big concern, I know, for me as a mom with 3 children, and there have been a lot of studies done that point to issues when they've done tests on animals. In fact, a couple of years ago in France, a Dr. Seralini did the first long-term feeding study on rats, 2 years. The rats developed massive mammary tumors, organ failure, along with other health risks. At a minimum, that should create some concern and should force our government to think that we need to do some additional studies. So health risks are big. The other huge issue is the environmental impact of GMOs. One thing that people don't realize is that GMOs were created to be resistant to the application of toxic chemicals like Roundup. The main ingredient in Roundup is glyphosate. This past year, glyphosate was designated by the World Health Organization as a probable human carcinogen. This is irrefutable.
And they also know that in Roundup, the carrier agents are sometimes more toxic than even the
Yes,
one that you're talking
absolutely.
about. So this is pseudoscience that's being foisted on us because of the profits, and the government allows this to happen because of the profits. And so I really resent government spending taxpayer dollars to enable Monsanto to make billions, and then we have to pay for the results in increased health care.
Yes.
There's a reason why our health care costs are skyrocketing and higher than any other country.
Yes.
And we have just as many sick people and we don't live as long. And so now we add GMOs to this mix. I mean, it's, I think it's really awful that the government can get away with it, but I'm not sure if it weren't for people like you, they would continue to.
Well, we have to hold them responsible, our
Yeah.
government. And I actually always say to our elected officials, stop looking at insurance as the solution to our healthcare cost issues, because we have a major problem in this country. Look at what we're eating, look at prevention, and let's start there. That's where we should be focusing our attention. And you're right, our government is completely bought out by the industry. And that's not an overstatement to say that.
No,
we
it's
have,
not.
We have major issues with our political system right now and the way that campaigns cost millions of dollars, and who's giving them those millions of dollars? Companies like Monsanto and the Grocery Manufacturers Association, the companies that are part of that, like Coke and Pepsi and Kraft. So when you're funneling money into the political system, you basically own our elected officials. It's very hard for them to break away from that when they know they have to get reelected and they need millions of dollars to do so.
And so we really need to have a shift in how campaigns are funded or allowed to be funded.
Yes, we need massive campaign finance reform. And I believe part of the reason we were able to pass a law in Connecticut is because we actually have wonderful campaign finance reform in Connecticut that does protect against corporations coming in and buying off our elected officials.
That's great.
Yeah, it is. It's wonderful.
And so people in countries, 60 countries around the world, can choose because they require GMO labeling. So, so where do we go to get to make this happen next?
Sure. So, and by the way, it's not just 60 countries require labeling. There's a substantial amount of countries, I'm not sure of the exact number off the top of my head, that ban GMOs altogether.
Yeah.
There's a big group of European countries right now that have just banned them. They don't want them grown there. And who can blame them?
They're smart.
Yes.
They're smart, and they don't have elected officials that are bought.
Correct. Well, and these companies are American companies. They're not European companies. So it, I mean, and it is a problem because I think that our country needs to start looking at focusing on different kinds of jobs because it could impact our economy, certainly, but we cannot put all our eggs in the basket of this toxic, very dangerous kind of agriculture.
Well, it's already impacting our bottom line in this country because we spend 20% of our gross income as a country on health care. And this is the reason. All of these, it's probably, I think it's something like 87% of food is sprayed with pesticides and toxins.
Right.
Who's in charge?
Who ever thought that was a good idea? Literally putting poison on our food.
Nerve gases.
Yeah.
They came out of World War II.
Yes, yes.
After World War II, they had tested these as pesticides as nerve gases.
They didn't know what to do with them.
They didn't know what to do with them, and they were looking for things, and they tested them on bugs, and farmers knew that they learned that they killed bugs really fast. And so without looking any further, because if they kill bugs really fast, imagine what eating them every day does to our nervous system.
Right. Right. It's very
and the nervous
scary.
system of children or small creatures who will be impacted much more quickly than large mammoths.
Yeah. I mean, I'll be honest, I'm truly frightened for the future of our children because I don't know how we protect them from this right now. It's all over, and we can't even make the choice to avoid GMOs, which, I mean, if you're eating GMOs, you're eating food smothered in chemicals because realize the amount of chemicals they can spray on those foods skyrockets because they don't have to worry about killing the vegetable. The vegetable's resistant to those chemicals. Yeah. And it gets worse because now they have already approved GMOs that are resistant to 2,4-D because Roundup doesn't work anymore. The weeds, you can't mess with nature.
Adapted.
The weeds have adapted. So now 2,4-D was one of the main components in Agent Orange.
That caused so much damage to veterans in Vietnam.
Yeah, and now that's going to be sprayed all over our food.
Well, you know, Tara, people ask me, because I'm working primarily for raise awareness for holistic mental health, and they ask me, why is there this epidemic of autism? Why is there this epidemic of Alzheimer's? And I say, we as a nation are overloaded with toxins.
Yes.
And no doctors have been trained to tell people you must do detoxification on a regular basis. And when a mother has her own toxins, so every generation since World War II is carrying a heavier toxic load because what the mother has in toxins is passed to the fetus, and then the fetus adds more in their lifetime. Right. So if nobody's detoxing, the kids that are being born now are overwhelmed with toxins at birth.
Yes.
And those of the older generation who are developing Alzheimer's may have been spraying toxins, they may have been farmers, they may have lived on a golf course where it was sprayed all the time or near farms. So I think we're seeing the canary in a coal mine is actually the children that indicates that we're reaching a threshold that humans cannot tolerate.
Right. And without labeling of GMOs, we can't make the connection. We can't track.
We don't know.
Right. We don't know. There's no way to know.
Right. So what is the current status of Connecticut and the law that you got passed here?
So in 2013, we passed the first in the nation GMO labeling law, which I really am very proud of.
Oh, you should be.
We had an amazing team of individuals throughout this state working. It was a team effort. I feel like I have one of the loudest mouths, so I get a lot of the credit, but it was a team effort, and I'm so grateful to everybody that I worked with. It did have a trigger clause in it, which means that the bill does not go into effect until 4 states throughout the country also pass a law, and we also need an aggregate population of 20 million within the Northeast of states that pass this law.
Explain why that's important.
Well, it's important
to the lawmakers.
Sure, because they felt, number one, they didn't want to go at it alone. I mean, truth be told, They didn't need to do that. It was a compromise that we reached that made the legislators feel comfortable that we could do this. They were getting threats of lawsuits. They were getting threats that the industry would stop selling food in Connecticut if they had to label. So they were nervous, and we're a small state.
Right.
But since then, Vermont, which is a third of the size of Connecticut, has passed a law that will implement this July 2016, with no trigger clause.
Great.
So we are going to go back to the legislature this year and ask Connecticut legislators to remove the trigger and implement with Vermont. There is no reason Connecticut can't move forward if Vermont is. And in addition to that, Massachusetts and Rhode Island are very close to passing laws. 3/4 of the legislature in Massachusetts has already signed on to their GMO labeling law there.
That's great.
So yes, the Northeast is really, truly leading the way.
Well, and I think in Massachusetts, in the case of Massachusetts, because probably every fourth person works in the health industry.
Right, that's so true.
And so they're very knowledgeable about the risks of disease, and they're very knowledgeable about the damage that all of this can cause.
Yes.
So that's great. I'm so thrilled I didn't know that. I haven't been keeping track of the latest.
Yeah,
so.
I'm keeping track.
Well, I'll let you keep it for me.
Sure.
So, and what is the situation with the DARK Act? What
Sure.
is that DARK?
So the DARK Act is an acronym for Deny Americans the Right to Know Act. That's something that
I love
advocates
it.
have
It
coined.
sounds Darth Vader-ish.
Yes, it does. And we call it that because it will keep Americans in the dark about what they're eating. So the real name for it down in DC is the Safe and Accurate Food Labeling Law, which is the most bogus title I've ever heard for a law.
I was going to say, that's
right.
industry-inspired bunk.
Completely. I mean, this is the industry wish list,
Right.
this bill. It essentially would codify a voluntary labeling standard that's basically been in effect for a very long time, but it's not working. Do you see anybody voluntarily labeling GMOs? I certainly don't.
Monsanto would never voluntarily
Never.
label anything.
No.
Not even a parking place.
Correct. So this DARK Act codifies that, which then would mean the federal government could not even pass a mandatory labeling
That's
law.
what they're hoping for.
Correct. And then
Right.
it goes a step further. It bans states from passing GMO labeling laws. So it would nullify the law in Connecticut, it would nullify the law in Vermont, and Maine had also passed a law. It would
So what happened to
preempt
states'
that.
rights? I think there's a constitution, isn't there?
You know, it's kind of amazing because it feels like they're putting industry rights above state rights, above our own personal rights. And this is a Republican Congress, not to get political, but a Republican Congress that claims that state rights are so important. Yet when it comes to the industry, Monsanto and the Grocery Manufacturers Association,
Right, and
it's
Dow.
essentially, remember, chemical companies and junk food companies.
Yeah.
Two companies that are two industries making us sick, fighting to keep us in the dark about what we're eating.
Right.
And when it comes to their rights, forget state rights, they don't seem to matter.
Right. So I wonder what our legislators think about the Constitution.
I know. We're actually very fortunate in Connecticut. So far, the DARK Act did make it through the House down in D.C., but none of our congressmen and congresswomen voted in favor of the DARK Act. They all voted against it. Unfortunately, it passed. We did not have the majority in the House. So right now, it's sitting in the Senate, and we are hoping that it never even sees the light of day in the Senate. And again, we're very fortunate because Senator Murphy and Senator Blumenthal are outspoken advocates for us, especially Senator Blumenthal. And
Yeah,
he actually
he's very experienced at
wonderful. And
this.
he made a statement back in the summertime after the DARK Act passed the House that said the DARK Act is dead on arrival as far as he's concerned in the Senate, and that we will drive a stake through the heart of the DARK Act. And that was the quote that made it across the country because advocates were so excited by that.
Well, he is a fierce fighter and a really wonderful man.
Yes.
When I was doing environmental advocacy, I followed him much more then. And when they were trying to dig up Long Island Sound and put in pipeline, he was able to help stop that.
Yes.
So
He's wonderful.
yeah, he's my hero. So what can individuals who are watching do to help right now?
Sure. Well, first I would say call your U.S. congressmen and women and also Senator Murphy and Senator Blumenthal and thank them for standing up for our rights and for standing against the Dark Act and advocating for GMO labeling. It's just as important to call and say thank you as it is when you're telling your legislators you don't like what they did. So that's the number one thing you can do. And then number two, because we're going to be looking to remove the trigger clause in Connecticut, we need everyone to get really loud again. And in 2013, that law passed because you, the people of Connecticut, were so powerful and used your voice, and we need you to use your voice again. So email your state senator and your state representative. If you're not sure who they are, it's very easy to find that information. Email them, call them, request a meeting with them, and tell them why GMO labeling is so important to you. Tell them that you believe you have a right to know so that you can make your own choices about how to feed your family and yourselves.
That's great. And so with this Washington, D.C., what's going to happen now? What's the next? When do they need to do this?
Okay, so that's a really great question, because if they don't pass the Dark Act by the end of this year, then I believe we've won, because companies will have to start changing over their labels for Vermont come the new year.
Okay.
So that is why they are pushing so hard in Washington, D.C. right now to try to pass this Dark Act as quickly as they can, because the opposition does not want to label for Vermont. And if the Dark Act doesn't pass, come January, all of these food companies have to start changing over their labels. If they can do it for Vermont, they can do it for Connecticut and everywhere else in this country.
And Rhode Island and Massachusetts.
Everywhere, yes.
Right. So, so they need to call and right now.
Yes.
Because we only have a couple of months.
Correct. So if you live in Connecticut, thank Senator Blumenthal and Murphy for standing up for us, and ask them to continue advocating for us. If you're watching this and you're not from Connecticut, you need to call your senators and ask them to oppose the Dark Act, because unfortunately a lot of senators throughout the country have not committed to being against the Dark Act yet. We've done our work in Connecticut, but other folks still have work to do.
Okay, so there's still a lot of unknowns, and it can roll really rapidly.
It can, and that's exactly what happened in the House. We were not expecting a vote when the vote came down, but some space opened up, and all of a sudden they were voting on the Dark Act. Exactly.
Yeah, they sneak it through, or they attach it to something else and take it through.
That is the other fear, that the Dark Act could be attached to a must-pass funding bill, something to keep Washington ticking, and that could be disastrous, because it will be very hard to stop that from moving forward then. So we have to make sure that our champions in DC are paying attention and making sure that if the Dark Act gets attached somewhere, we know about it and they fight to remove it.
Right, right. Okay. Well, I admire the work that you are doing, and I'm grateful for it, because you're helping all of us. You're helping to protect not just your children, but all of us and our children and grandchildren too. So thank you so much, Tara. It's been a delight to have you with me, and we'll look forward to having you back, and hopefully to celebrate the death of the Dark Act.
That would be wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you for watching us, and please join us again for Restoring Health Holistically.